you actually met an oligarch that you got the idea to this film because you actually wanted to make a third documentary in Indonesia, but then you met this, I think, former Soviet oligarch, and he showed you around in his bunker, and that made so many questions to you, and many questions in your mind. You told me, and I would actually like you to tell the story how you got this idea.
Yeah, so I had wanted to go to back to Indonesia to make a film about the billionaires, the oligarchs who became wealthy by exploiting a country that was terrified of them because they had participated in the genocide there in the 1960s. But I was unable to return to Indonesia and still have not been able to return to Indonesia safely since the act of killing came out all those years ago. And so I started investigating oligarchs who had earned money through violence elsewhere, and found this oil tycoon who had used violence to obtain his drilling rights, to clear the land and obtain the land for his oil fields. And he was buying, as you say, a bunker like the one you've just seen, and he invited me with his family to tour through it, to look at it. And I was haunted by these questions that there was no way I could ask. Chief among them, how would you cope with the guilt for the catastrophe from which you would be fleeing? How would you cope with your remorse for leaving loved ones behind? Because it was clear that they planned to bring very few people, and I could understand that his wife in particular had already sort of been preparing in her relationships with the family for excluding them in the future from this part of her life. Maybe she was already holding them at arm's length. Maybe as my imagination grew, she had sort of married into the money and was excluding them to kind of keep the gold diggers at bay or something. But those relationships were sort of hollowed out between her and her family, and how would she cope with the remorse of ultimately leaving them behind? How would they raise a new generation in such a place as a kind of blank canvas onto which they could paint an idealized portraits of themselves to ease their own regrets? And I found these questions terrifying if you really think about them, if you don't think of them as satire. They're spiritual, you're gazing into a kind of emotional and spiritual desert. And on the way home, I thought the only film I can make with this family now would be the documentary in the bunker 25 years after they move in. And I wasn't going to do that. So just to clear my mind, I put on one of my favorite films, Jacques Demy's The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, on the airplane home. That's a P in the Parapluie?
Yeah, P in the Parapluie, yeah.
And then afterwards, it just came to me in an epiphany. I thought, I know, I'll make a film. It'll be called The End. The family will be American. It'll be a golden age musical set 25 years after the families moved into the bunker. And then that was the start, really, of a new career for me. Mm-hmm. And 8 years later, I suppose, here it is. And I guess I knew it had to be a musical because this is the quintessential genre of a kind of false hope. What's actually despair in the sheep's clothing of hope, in which we say, because we're either too scared or too defensive or just have too much numbness or inertia to admit the problems that are looming and only getting worse, to admit that we're headed toward an abyss, we tell ourselves, oh, somehow everything will work out for the best. Somehow the sun will come up tomorrow. Somehow, as mother and girl were just singing, our future is bright, even when they're staring into the void, into the abyss. And that's really despair, and this genre is really the ultimate genre of that kind of self-deception, and I thought that's really what the film is about in this moment of danger that we collectively are living through right now.
Yeah, not much hope, I would say, but still, you actually you see you have a message of hope. And before we're taking questions from the public, could you elaborate on where you see hope in the end?
Yeah, I think you just said to me outside, you said it's hopeful somehow. And I thought about that after you said it. And I think there's sort of three ways, at least two ways it's kind of hopeful. Obviously, it's a tragedy for this family. I don't see hope in the fact that they've had a baby. I see them as kind of descended from the, I don't know, third circle of hell down to the final circle of hell. But to me, it's a cautionary tale. And you don't come together, hundreds of people, marshaling these resources and this creativity to make a cautionary tale, unless you still believe there's time for me, for you, for all of us, to heed the warning. And I'm happy you came to see this film in a cinema, and hope, if you're here alone, I hope you feel some solidarity with your fellow cinema goers, or at least with me, because when you leave this place, there's still a breathable atmosphere. There's still a sky. There's still time, I fervently believe and hope, for us to get our act together and change before it's too late. I just came back from Berlin, and one of the beautiful things I did in Berlin, I was asked by a climate activist there, was kind of like a German Greta Thunberg named Luisa Neubauer. She asked me to join the climate march in Berlin on Friday, which was very big this time because of the election. It's a kind of continuation of the Friday climate strikes. And I was terrified. I thought I would be terrified standing before tens of thousands of people. And I got up on the stage and I saw a collective, not isolated individuals, but a collective like I see in this room now, or like we can decide to be, because you each bought your tickets in pairs or individually, but actually we can decide right now to be a collective and to hold that spirit of solidarity when you leave here and you meet your colleagues and your friends and your fellow union members and your family members tomorrow. But I looked out over these tens of thousands of people, and my fear simply vanished because I saw hope. I saw the solution to the climate crisis right there. I saw the solution to the democracy crisis right there. And in the hearts of these thousands of people who felt the need to reach out to their neighbors and energize each other, inspire each other's creativity, and give each other the courage to stand up in a moment which really could get very dangerous. And I just realized this is as the dark clouds of authoritarianism build in my native country, the United States of America, and here in Europe, as the climate grows more and more unwelcoming to human life, this solidarity that I saw in front of me is much more than a silver lining. It is the solution, and it's more than a silver lining because it's also our full humanity. So when I say there's still time, I don't mean there's still time for you to become a vegan or to take the train rather than to fly, though you should do that too if that's what your conscience tells you. Yes, it might be. But we never solve our problems alone. We solve our problems together. And there's time for you to reach out and take the risk and even be a little embarrassing and say to your fellow members of your Andelsboli Frieding board, if you sit on such a board, shouldn't we spend 10 minutes at each meeting now talking about the state of the world and what we're going to do about it as a community? Whether it's the climate, whether what's happening with the rising tide of totalitarianism in Europe, now is the time we're called upon to expand beyond our isolated bunkers, our little bubbles, and reach out to the widest possible human family, and to take action, and to speak truth to power, as Louisa put it yesterday to Sina, the producer who's here with me today. That's one form of hope. And then I think there's another kind of hope here, which has to do with the compassion with which we look at these people, with the empathy. Because there's a passage late in the Bhagavad Gita which talks about the monsters, and in the I do not believe there are monsters, there are only human beings, but in the Bhagavad Gita there certainly are monsters. And they're living in hell, and they're caught, and their hell really is composed of all the awful things that they do to each other and to themselves and to the world that makes their lives empty and meaningless and ugly and destructive. And there's this wonderful passage in the Bhagavad Gita which says, the only way the world can be saved from these monsters is to regard them with such love, for them to feel such and experience such compassion and love that they themselves feel the need to change. And I think that's what happens in the middle of this film, from the arrival of the girl up until New Year's. Everyone's heart is tugged with a longing to change. And they're unable to do that because they're the last human family, and their very existence is a kind of manifestation of destruction. It would be kind of grotesque if you had a film called The End about the final family in a bunker and then they all lived happily ever after. But within the film, there's a hope that we see them with love and warmth for those of you who were able to do so. Because just consider the alternative, where you look at them as the kind of villains of another Eat the Rich satire. Throughout the film, you try to find a way to laugh at them. You hope justice and comeuppance will come. You hope they'll meet a sticky end, like, for example, in Parasite or something. And at the end, you can sort of pat yourself on the back because you leave reassured that you're not one of them. That would leave us in the same stuck polarization that we're in now. So I'm not saying we don't speak truth to power. We shouldn't stand up to the wealthy. We shouldn't stand up to the people who are trashing the planet, but we have to start also and look at them as human beings and recognize that they are lying to themselves, but so are we. That every time we read about the genocide in Gaza, and I mention that deliberately because that's being carried out in my name as a Jew, and it makes me furious and it breaks my heart. Or we read about 1,000 people drowning in the Mediterranean Sea, escaping conditions of misery that we knowingly impose upon them, and we feel momentarily heartsick, but then pivot and find just the right sad emoji to put on social media, and through that sentimental gesture, get a little dopamine kick because we start getting likes, or we start getting reassurance from our friends that they agree, and we, through that sentimental gesture, give ourselves permission to quickly pivot to something more fun, always as an isolated individual, guided by an algorithm. Whenever we do that, whenever we don't reach out to our friends and ask for help to kick that habit, because it is a habit and we've been deliberately addicted to these things, we willingly place ourselves in the same bunker that you've just seen on the screen. So what appears to be about the future is also about our present.
Right, but I like your point with love and solidarity. That's what you say we should expand.
Yes, we should.
Yeah, okay, great. But then I think maybe we should have questions if somebody of you would like to ask Joshua about something. Mm-hmm. It's hard
There's
to
someone
see.
there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's somebody.
Someone wearing black and bald but with glasses.
No, I'm not bald.
You're not, I am. And I'm wearing black.
Men hvis du stiller spørgsmålet højt, så kan vi måske gentage, hvis
I would
alle...
love to hear something about the collaboration with the composer.
Oh, I'd love to talk about that.
Yeah. Hørte alle spørgsmålet?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. You know, one of the first things we realized is that in a golden age musical, first we had to, before we wrote, I worked with the composer, we had to place the songs in the film and guess where they came, and we realized very quickly that they come from these crises of doubt, these moments where all the lies that they're telling themselves are starting to unravel because truth or longing, which is also truth, is entering their bubble, and they turn, as their excuses, their rationalizations collapse, they desperately try through song to convince themselves that everything is okay. They make up new lies, they romanticize their life. So we realized that early on that the songs, and what keeps them singing is not just, they don't just escape into these lies. The songs are these active efforts to convince themselves of new lies, of new excuses, of new delusions. And often they fail, which means they often will hit these walls of truth or silence where they can't sing anymore, and they have to kind of pick themselves up and try again. And that led us to realize very early on, Joshua Schmidt, the composer, had the realization that the music would be these luminously beautiful lies punctuated by the silence of truth, which is sort of the opposite of the Golden Age cliche where characters sing their truths, sing when their truth is too big for speech. So the music is supposed to embody their truth. Here it sort of embodies the opposite, their lies, their self-deception. And that led Josh to realize that that I should write the lyrics, because these songs at their most intense would be these breakdowns in song, and only I, as one of the screenwriters and the director, would know the characters well enough to write what would inevitably be their most intimate moments. And then he taught me how to write lyrics that were conversational, not really poetry, because poetry, when you write lyrics, you still need room for the music to provide the poetry, and then you still need room for the subtext that comes with the performance. So if you write full poetry as lyrics, you lose that space. So for dramatic songwriting, we quickly learned that I was writing these kind of interior monologues or kind of almost lyrical dialogue when they're singing to each other. And then I would send him, he would almost always want the lyrics first before he'd write any music. And I would send him the music. I'd send him some draft lyrics, and then 1 or 2 days later, he would send me this extraordinary, polyphonic, complex, luminous, amazing music. And I felt like the sorcerer's apprentice. I didn't really know how a bit of text would elicit music. It was magical, because I would write some text, still banal, still not perfect, but it would create this thing that I had no capacity of making myself. But then he was so generous, he would invite me to make suggestions. Where could the melody be changed? Where does it feel right for the character? Where doesn't it? And I sometimes even let me just suggest melody lines. And meanwhile, he would make revisions to my lyrics. And so gradually, slowly, these songs took shape. And then he also was very clear, we're not writing 12 songs, we're writing a single piece of music, because if we can make the melodies reprise regularly, because these songs are self-deception, if you are already familiar with a melody and are unconsciously humming along in your head, you're experiencing, in a sense, with your own body, slipping into the character's skin and consoling yourself, reassuring yourself as they reassure themselves through song. And that led us to think of the whole score, and indeed the whole film, as a single piece of music, the way you would think of a symphony as a single work. And it was just the most thrilling collaboration of my life. And it all happened during lockdown, so we didn't actually meet in person when we wrote the songs at all.
It's wonderful.
Well, thank you.
Okay, Joshua, top masterpiece. Bravo. My question is about the paintings, because Karen told us about how you see this as a visual. How we are going to see some like tableau. And then these people in the bunker, they have selected, or you have selected, some art piece for them. So how did you choose? She said you were in North Denmark at that moment, thinking about light, but you select some precise paintings.
Yeah, did you hear the question in the back? It was about the selection of the paintings. How did I select them? It actually related to the same issue of the music, because once we knew that you are actually, through the songs, identifying with the characters when they convince themselves that they're living the very, through song, that they're living the very best version of their lives, then we realized that the bunker mustn't be a kind of concrete, relentlessly claustrophobic place. You should be able to forget sometimes that you're in a bunker. And how do you do that when there's no windows? Well, you can have light coming through kind of skylights, which was inspired by the White House. So we had the simulated daylight, and that allowed the light to change during the songs. We had the interiors of the house and the exteriors of the salt mine. We shot in a salt mine for 3 weeks of the 9-week shoot. So a third of the shoot was in that mine. But then we realized the paintings would be these windows onto a lost world that also, of course, never really existed, especially those romantic landscape paintings. They're kind of an idealization of nature, much like the father's memoir or the diorama are idealizations of the world before the bunker. But I think I've come to realize watching the film, I guess it's even in the script, the art plays another role too, which is upstaging the characters, which is to say behind them, as kind of bearing silent and sometimes indicting, accusing witness. There's that moment where Mother says, I wish we'd brought one of his other pieces, because this one's always staring at us. These works that expressed a critical social point of view when they were made, now meaningless because society is gone, but somehow ghosts from a society where there were values and there was critique that could have led the world in a different direction if we had risen and only listened.
Yeah, wow. I don't know, maybe we have time for one more question?
Let's do 2 more.
Okay, vi kan ikke se noget hernede, men otherwise
I have a question.
yeah.
When the father is having a depression or something like that, and go out in the mine and are falling, it seems like you are reproducing a well-famous painting from Dutch German art. Is that correct?
It is correct.
It is correct. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Oh, and now I don't remember the painting's name, but it's a famous painting.
It's something about the fog.
Yes, it's exactly, that was the painting that Misha and I looked at.
Okay. Yeah.
That's amazing, that's so well spotted. And it says something else to the songs. You know, sometimes people would ask me as we were planning the film, who were just getting into it, and say, well, why aren't the songs these sort of full-blown musical fantasy numbers? And I realized, on the contrary, the songs are these moments of longing and actually emotional breakdowns, as I said earlier, in song. And when you film performances this spectacular, this nuanced, this rich in song, you really should primarily bear witness, which is why the songs are shot in these long takes instead of just full-blown fantasy sequences. But of course there are elements of fantasy there from the beginning, like dawn rises over the course of the first song, or in some songs it's changing from sunlight to cloud, overcast light to sunlight to overcast light very quickly as they sing. And of course when he goes and kills himself but doesn't kill himself, that's some kind of a fantasy in a very attenuated form, or it's just bearing witness to his own inner state. I was just asked in Berlin, and the other consequence of these things being these emotional breakdowns on film, is that we realized that we needed actors who were musical, who could sing with radiant vulnerability in the voice of their characters in crisis, but we didn't need the grotesquely polished voices that we're accustomed to hearing both on Broadway but also in pop music, because we wanted to hear, there's nothing more beautiful than the vulnerable human being bearing their soul. And it also, but that meant that all of the vocals had to be done live. So all of the singing you've just seen was live, which was an incredible feat from this cast. I think you've just seen not an ensemble cast, you've seen a kind of doomsday cult that signed up for the rapture. And I think they're hopeful, and they're completely lost, and they're shockingly mortal. Yeah. Like all of us.
So true. Yeah. Er der flere spørgsmål? Ja.
There's two more. We'll take you
Okay.
both.
Perfect.
Thank you for the film and for your wonderful talk. I was wondering, how was it to transition from directing non-actors to having this huge ensemble, doomsday ensemble, and directing actors? And how did you switch to that kind of role as a director?
The switch from
Yeah.
actors from documentary to fiction, and specifically working with non-actors to actors. When I make a documentary, I'm always interested in the gap between how people want to be seen and how they really see themselves. And that's a little bit lonely, even if I'm working with someone, for me, even if I'm working with someone who I feel really full solidarity with. Like if you've ever seen my film, The Look of Silence, I feel complete solidarity with Adi Rukun, the protagonist. But what makes that, a lot of his material, a lot of the footage of him interesting is that there's this gap between how he wants to be seen and maybe how he really feels about the situation. And maybe even sometimes what his real intentions are in confronting the man who killed his brother. And I felt solidarity, but we're never really fully on the same page. We're never really fully, I don't want to say honest, because we were honest, but it was like we could never fully understand he could never fully understand what I was doing, and I could never fully have the same motivations as he had. Obviously, when I was making The Act of Killing, if you know that film, there I'm working with perpetrators of mass murder. That gap, working with the same gap between how they wanted to be seen and how they really see themselves. And there, that could sometimes, with people I didn't know very well, be a lack of transparency. It had to be sometimes from me. Sometimes it was, sometimes I couldn't be entirely honest about what I felt, about what they were telling me. And that again, over months and years of filming and getting very close to someone, but never being able to 100% feel together, that was lonely. And in a fiction film with actors like this, they find the subtext by finding secrets, by thinking about what is the character fronting, what are they admitting to, and what are they hiding. And those are questions we can discuss together. So suddenly there was this full communion, this full transparency, this full solidarity with the cast, which doesn't mean it was always fun. There was, of course, conflict sometimes, and there was, of course, difficult days and wonderful days. We were always on both sides, on all sides, striving for honesty. And that, for me, was very fulfilling. I grew up in a family where there was divorce, and I was kind of trying to reassure my mother of her narrative and my father of his narrative, a little bit like the son in this film. And that made me naturally conflict averse, get uncomfortable with conflict. And I guess, to me, working with actors was a little bit like a belated coming of age. I think I also felt that two things, that when I make a documentary and a fiction film, I'm doing the same thing in the sense that I'm looking always for those moments that take my breath away, because I instantly recognize them as true, because they're not what I expected. It's not what I pre-visualized. Now in a documentary, that means that the turning point of a scene is always something unexpected, so the scene is never what you make your whole film out of these scenes you never could have imagined, but feel inevitable when they actually happen. In a fiction film, it means you do know where the turning points are because it's written, but you're still looking for that same kind of breathtaking authenticity. And then just a corollary to this question, I'm often asked like how weird to go from documentary to musical. But suddenly it occurred to me, I was just asked that question again today, and sometimes if you're asked the same question many times, you finally get the answer. It's like, no, it totally makes sense to go from documentary to a musical. Because when you work with documentary, you have this, the material is sacred because it's life, it's so raw, it's so vulnerable, and truthful. And if you transition to ordinary drama, I can imagine that it might feel like fake. But if you skip over ordinary drama to a musical where people are way out on a limb in uncharted territories, suddenly everything is vulnerable again and raw. And so I think maybe it's the natural genre shift from documentary to music.
Logic.
And then there was one last one, and then I'll let it go. Unless it's evaporated.
Var der et sidste spørgsmål? Det skal nok være det sidste. Men det var der måske ikke.
Could you tell us, please, about the last image sequence of the
Yeah.
I would love to.
Yeah, that's good.
So,
Og hørte alle det? Det sidste billede, om Joshua vil fortælle om det.
yeah, the film is an allegory for the entire human family. It's an allegory for each and every one of our families. These characters are nameless because they're me and they're you. The end is mortality. It's the species' mortality because one day the species will end, whether it's due to climate catastrophe or something else. And it's our mortality because one day we will end. Some of us might end much sooner than we should. Some of us might know our end is coming, and we won't have time to find out how things go with the climate or whatever. But in that sense, for me, the film is also about, above all, love, and about how when we lie to ourselves, and when we impose those lies, especially on the people we love, but on our neighbors and on the whole society, on the whole human community, when we tell ourselves we can be cruel and unwelcoming to the stranger, vulnerable stranger, while we know we should actually welcome the vulnerable stranger, we hurt ourselves because we're lying to ourselves. We undermine our own chance to have a meaningful life because we start living a lie and we become defensive. So this is a film about how our ability to love is hollowed out when we lie. And so it exists on these two totally different levels at all times, the macro and the micro. And as mother and girl seeing this final lie, girl struggling to suppress her tears and really believe that her future is bright as she faces the abyss. And standing there beside mother, and they slowly start to fade away into what appears to be the Milky Way, the cosmos. But then very slowly we realize, oh, this isn't the cosmos, this is the microcosmos. It's plankton or microscopic organisms in water. And there's those two scales that we are always, each and every one of us, always inhabiting. Somehow become one in one shot. It's what the whole film's about. And for those who think, well, it's primitive life that will be here when human life is extinct, that will be here when we're all gone, that's what will remain. I would just end on a cautionary note. The oceans are so acidic, and with each year that we dump more and more carbon into the atmosphere, ever more acidic, and the little endoskeletons that's inside those creatures that allow them to grow can no longer form. The calcium carbonates are having trouble forming in our acidic oceans. And soon, the plankton that you see in that film won't be able to grow and reproduce anymore in our oceans. And the bottom of the marine food chain will completely collapse, and with it, marine life in general, and with it, the atmosphere will become a suffocating blend of noxious fumes. And that'll be it. So if we carry on, without changing, without leaving here and reaching out to everyone you know and saying, what can we do to live honestly and to live better and to address this problem now? That isn't the life that'll be here when we're gone. That's the life that'll be here in 2 million years, when the carbon cycle of the Earth has brought the pH of our oceans back into balance, or it is indeed somewhere out on another planet, elsewhere in the Milky Way.
Thank you to you for your film and for spending time with us. It was so great.